in Washington. A consensus that Republicans and Democrats, the right and the left, can come to one agreement on. Who's at fault for the mess in Iraq? Well, the Iraqis, of course. You've heard this before. This sectarianism, the civil war that has killed so many innocent people in Iraq as well as our own troops. That this was deep-seated. It's a deeply rooted, inherent sectarianism. It was always there. It was only inevitable that if you removed a murderous megalomaniac like Saddam Hussein, that this was going to happen. It was inevitable. Not really our fault. And as far as, the anti-Americanism in that region, well, I even said, it was always there. So, okay, perhaps it surged in the last year or so. But again, not our fault. That region has always been anti-American, and particularly Iraqis. And so you have the conservative columnist for the New York Times, Charles Krauthammer, say not too long ago, quote, "We gave the Iraqis a republic, and they do not appear able to keep it." Our Senator Barbara Boxer, who's probably about as liberal as it gets in the Senate, recently concurred and said, quote, "We gave the Iraqis their freedom. What are they doing with this freedom? They're killing each other." Now, I think it's understandable for all of us here, the appeal of this particular narrative. It's the Iraqis' fault narrative. This was inevitable, nothing to do about it. It's not our responsibility. The Republicans love it, because it tends to deflect any kind of responsibility off of their shoulders. If this was inevitable, then it's not their fault. And the Democrats seem to be rallying to this view as well, because it seems to bolster the prevailing sentiment that we should just get the heck out of Iraq as fast as possible. Because again, there's nothing we can do. This is an inherent, deep-seated anger and hatred, and these people are going to kill each other whether we're there or not, so let's just leave and let them kill each other. The problem is that this, I think, is quite a disingenuous viewpoint of what's been taking place in Iraq. Fact of the matter is that sectarianism, as we are seeing it, this civil war that we are seeing in Iraq, is not a deeply seated, deeply rooted, inherent conflict that was just waiting to burst out into the open. Actually, quite the contrary. The Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds in Iraq have fought together as one against the British. They fought together as one against the Iranians in the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq from 1980 to 1988. And in fact, in the months after the invasion, and I know how hard it is to think back of what 2003 was like, but in the months after the invasion, poll after poll of Iraqis showed not just a 70% favorability towards Americans and towards the occupation. Like I said, that was a long time ago. It's hard to remember that long. But also, repeatedly, Iraqis were deliberately eschewing their sectarian identities, calling themselves not Shia or Sunni or Kurdish, but Iraqis, in a deliberate attempt to create some semblance of a unified government. But in a country in which there is no hope for any kind of security, in which you cannot rely on either the police or the army, or for that matter, the occupational authority, who according to international law is responsible for your safety. When the only hope that you have of staying alive as long as possible, and we should remind ourselves that in the 4 years of this war, nearly 700,000 Iraqis have been killed. At a certain point, you recognize that the only hope you have to stay alive is to attach yourself to a sect, if not to a sectarian militia. Yes, there is this internal migration taking place within Iraq. Yes, we are seeing what can be only described as ethnic cleansing in Iraqi neighborhoods. We are seeing the homogenization of Iraq. But it's not because sectarian identities are becoming more solidified. It's because the only hope for survival in Iraq anymore is to find yourself a sect and attach yourself to it. And even then, you're not doing so hot. As Fareed Zakaria said, and I think quite smartly, we did not give Iraqis a republic. We gave them a civil war. Simply by the fact that we were incapable of providing the kind of security that would create the stability necessary for a civil war to be warded off. So I don't think that it's the Iraqis' fault answer is a good enough answer to explain how we've gotten to where we are. So what else? What other reasons can we give? Well, there is another chorus, another narrative being formed, and that is that, well, the reason we're in the situation that we're in now is because of the sheer incompetence of this administration. And there's certainly plenty of reason to think about this. In fact, it seems as though every month or so there's a new book that gets published. Fiasco, horror, chaos, destruction. Very rarely do you hear books about Iraq called wonderful, excellent, great idea. And I think that's because there has been, as we all know, an enormous amount of evidence about the poor planning that went into the Iraq invasion, about the willful errors, about the haphazard decisions, about the deliberate ignorance. We can talk about the examples on and on. I can sit here and give you example after example. My personal favorite example is when we decided to disband 450,000 members of the armed forces, but forgot to disarm them first. Probably not the best idea. But again, I don't think just the list of incompetence and the list of poor decisions is enough to explain how we have gotten to the point where the war in Iraq may be lost and the war on terror is certainly being lost. I think it takes something deeper than this, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I think in some ways, the reason we're where we are is that from the very beginning, the framework, the way that we understood this conflict, led us down the path to failure. The very term itself, war on terror, is sort of difficult to fathom. What exactly does that mean? I mean, after all, terror is not an enemy, terror is a tactic. How one goes about declaring war on a tactic, particularly a tactic that for millennia has proven itself to be very effective in leveling the battlefield between the strong and the weak, is besides me. And honestly, I think most of us in this room know that the very term war on terror is meant as a rhetorical flourish. It's supposed to remind us of things like the war on drugs or the war on poverty. By the way, how are those two things going? Have we won the war on drugs and time to move on? Yeah, right. But the real problem, I think, with this terminology is that it creates what I call an undifferentiated enemy. In other words, it becomes almost impossible to sort of put our finger upon who exactly is the enemy in this war. And I think that if you asked most Americans, you would probably get a whole host of different answers. And this isn't their fault. It's because our political leadership hasn't done a very good job, probably because they can't really figure it out themselves, telling us who it is that we're fighting this war on terror on. I mean, it's not just terrorists. We're not just fighting terrorists. As far as I know, we've yet to declare war on the Basque separatists. We've yet to declare war on the Tamil Tigers. We've yet to declare war on the Iranian terrorist organization Mujahideen al-Khalq. In fact, quite the opposite. This group, the MEK, is probably the only terrorist organization, the only organization both on the U.S. terrorist watch list and the European terrorist watch list whose offices are in downtown D.C. next to the Treasury Department. So it's not just terrorism that we're battling here. So who is the enemy? Well, there's been an enormous amount of effort, I think, in the last few years to give a pithy and concise answer to this question, one that we can just point to very easily and say, aha, they are the enemy. And so this narrative, again, and you'll be hearing me talk about narratives a lot today, this narrative has been formed that the enemy is this united global movement that includes Hezbollah, Hamas, the Iranian regime, the Kashmiri militants, the Chechen rebels, and of course Al-Qaeda and the larger jihadist network, that all of these groups represent a single unified enemy that we're at war against in this so-called war on terror. We've even given them sort of a